The story started with our protagonist using magic arrow spell for hunting down monster birds in a forest when he came across an unconscious girl lying on the ground. He crouched beside her and asked if she was all right. She was young, with light hair, and she was completely unconscious. He picked her up carefully and carried her out of the forest. 2 days passed. Albert had brought the girl to his small cottage and cared for her while she slept. He prepared a meal and set it on the table. And when she finally woke up, he placed a bowl in front of her and told her she had been asleep the whole time and to eat without holding back. She came to her senses slowly and ate with visible enthusiasm, then thanked him and said he had treated her to quite a feast. He asked her name, and she asked his first. He told her his name was Albert. She smiled and introduced herself as Laura. She thanked him sincerely for saving her and explained that she had walked all the way from her hometown to take the entrance exam for the Royal Magic Academy, but had collapsed from exhaustion before she could get there. Laura noticed a magic book in the room and asked if Albert was a mage. He said he had taken an interest and dabbled a little. She asked why. He paused, then told her plainly that he had once aimed for the Magic Academy himself, but gave it up because he had no talent. She looked surprised and apologized for bringing it up carelessly. He told her not to worry, that it was all in the past. Laura asked when the entrance exam was scheduled. She said it was tomorrow, February 17th at noon. Albert stared at her for a moment, then told her he was sorry. February 17th was today. She had been asleep for 2 full days. The realization hit her hard. Her face crumpled and she started crying, apologizing in her mind to her village chief, her uncle, her aunt, her parents, and everyone back home who had seen her off with so much encouragement. Albert told her not to look so down. He said there were still 4 hours until noon and that he would carry her there using magic arrow. He told her to get ready and meet him outside. She ran out and found him waiting. He asked if she was ready and she said yes. He told her to hold on tight and they launched into the sky together. As they flew, Laura asked about the range of his magic arrow. Albert explained that magic arrow was a super basic spell that nearly all mages learn first, just a white arrow that hits a target with a range of about 50 meters. She pointed out that shooting a bird in flight from below at only 50 meters would be incredibly difficult. He said yes, that was true. Then he told her his range was 13 kilometers. She went completely silent for a moment, then called it amazing and wondered out loud if this was a revolution. Albert fired another magic arrow mid-flight to propel them even faster. Laura cried out in awe, barely able to keep up with what was happening. He told her to be careful not to bite her tongue as they were about to change direction. As they flew, Albert thought back on how things came to be. He had spent the last 10 years reading magic books whenever he had free time, looking only at the magic arrow pages. His magic arrow had grown stronger because of that, though he admitted even he didn't fully understand how he became capable of this. His thoughts drifted further back. When he was young, he had discovered he could use magic arrow without any training at all. Everyone in the mansion had been astonished. His father, who was a mage himself, told him there was no need to rush and that becoming a mage required rigorous training from a young age. Trusting those words, Albert had thrown himself into studying magic, and at 15 he enrolled in the Royal Magic Academy, believing he would surely become someone great. That was where everything fell apart. No matter how hard he tried, no spell other than magic arrow would work for him. He struggled through less than a year before running away from the academy. He wandered for a while, ran out of money, and eventually went back to his parents' home. His father met him at the door with cold eyes and told him he was banished and to never call himself a luminous again. In that memory, he also recalled the words of his father and others, that a dullard like him bringing shame to a noble house was worse than not enrolling at all. His father had said at least if he had stayed home and hidden away, the family name wouldn't have been tarnished. Albert had called out to him, but the door had already closed. His younger brother had always been held up as the brilliant one, and Albert had been compared to him unfavorably for as long as he could remember. His father had once said plainly that if the birth order had been reversed, they wouldn't have had anything to worry about. It was frustrating, but Albert had never been able to say anything back. Back in the present, Laura turned to him mid-flight and told him his magic arrow was wonderful and that he had to show that talent to the world. Albert looked at her, a simple, honest suggestion from someone who knew nothing of his past. He said he supposed so. Something in him that had been still for a long time began, quietly, to move. They arrived at the Royal Magic Academy just in time. Albert said it looked like they had made it, and Laura thanked him warmly as they touched down. Albert stood and stared at the building. It was a bitter memory for him. The longing he had once felt for this place had long since turned into something else, and yet nothing about the academy had changed from 10 years ago. He recalled, too, the pride he had once felt being admitted, and how quickly that had crumbled. He had decided on the way here that he would also take the entrance exam himself. He thought of the world waiting past those gates and accepted quietly that he was ready to try again. The exam area was already crowded with candidates. A teacher at the front addressed the group, declaring that the academy didn't close its gates to those with talent, and that today, court mage Carlisle would be observing. Albert tugged Laura's sleeve and asked who that was. was. He said he didn't know. She stared at him in disbelief. Laura explained that Carlisle possessed exceptional talent, even by the Academy's history. He had become a court mage at only 25 years old, the youngest in history. A court mage was a mage permitted to serve the royal family directly. In the world of mages, the number of spells one could control was everything. Mastering 100 spells made one a full-fledged mage. The legendary mage Magnus had controlled 1,000 spells and was hailed as the 1,000, the envy of every mage in history. Carlisle, at only 25, controlled 700 spells, and some said he might even surpass Magnus someday. The crowd erupted in awe as Carlisle stepped forward. He addressed the examinees directly, smiling with easy confidence. Told them he was only there to audit whether the exam was being conducted properly, not to grade them. And so the ones who should be nervous were the teachers, not the examinees. He told everyone to relax and show their best. The first practical exam was announced. Each candidate was to fire 3 magic arrows at a target set 30 meters away. The targets had protective magic cast on them so they wouldn't break. The examiner called candidates up by number. Laura, registered as number 390, wished Albert good luck as his number 389 was called first. He stepped forward. Albert cast magic arrow at the first target. The bolt struck it, and the target, fully enchanted with protective magic, exploded completely apart. The examiner shouted in surprise. The crowd went into an uproar. Albert looked at what remained and noted to himself that the first target was gone, then asked the examiner what he should do next. The examiner called it an anomaly and told Albert to continue to the next target. Albert said he understood, stepped up, and cast magic arrow again. The second target was also obliterated. The crowd erupted louder. One examiner said it was impossible for both to have failed for maintenance. The lead examiner turned on Albert and accused him of cheating, saying he must have used other magic and that something protected by magic couldn't be destroyed by a basic spell. Albert said flatly that he had not cheated. Carlisle stepped in. He asked Albert directly, with a relaxed tone, whether he cheated. He said he did not. He said Albert claimed he didn't. So wasn't that fine? The examiner protested that there had to be evidence of something. Carlisle told him that an examiner's job was to grade examinees and identify cheating, and that without proof, there was nothing to discuss. The examiner fumbled but had nothing to show. Albert pointed out that he still had one shot remaining and hadn't finished. Carlisle acknowledged that it would be a problem if any more targets got broken. So with a wide grin, he offered to step in as a substitute targeter. The examiner was horrified. Carlisle asked coolly if he thought he, the 7th-ranked court mage, could possibly get hurt by this. He said not in a billion years. She cast hard protection on herself, a powerful layered defensive barrier, and told Albert to fire whenever he was ready. Laura and the other examinees watched in stunned silence. Albert faced her. Albert said he understood and told her there was no need for him to hold back. He raised his hand. He fired. The magic arrow struck Carlisle's hard protection barrier head-on. The barrier cracked and shattered. The arrow's momentum wasn't killed. The impact drove Carlisle backward, his protective shell fragmenting around him. His expression shifted from amusement to genuine surprise. He was slammed into the ground, and the shockwave shook the entire area. The watching crowd erupted. A massive explosion of force scattered dust and debris across the field. The crowd was completely stunned into silence. When the dust settled, Carlisle rose from the ground with a wide grin and said one word, interesting. He looked at Albert and told him he had enjoyed that. The crowd broke into excited cheering, calling him amazing and as overwhelming as expected. Albert walked over and asked if he was satisfied now. He said yes, and declared that the exam was over and that he had done well, then thanked him for going along with it. Albert extended his hand toward Carlisle. The examiner immediately shouted that asking to shake hands with Carlisle-sama was rude beyond belief and called him a fool. Carlisle told him to wait and asked what his name was. Albert turned and told him it was Albert. He repeated it, Albert, and said he would remember that. Then he placed his hand on his head lightly and gave him a small pat. Carlisle turned and walked away. Laura ran over to Albert the moment he stepped back. She was bursting with excitement, asking if he really got Carlisle-sama to take his magic and saying that opportunities like that were incredibly rare. Albert blinked and said that was true. He thought to himself that he probably should have fired at full power while he had the chance. A moment later, Laura's number, 390, was called. She startled, straightened up, and dashed off. Albert told her to do her best. Laura stepped up to the target range. Magic arrow was the foundation of all magic and what most mages learn first. She fired and struck all 3 targets cleanly. The narration noted she hit every target, proof she had been training. Albert watched her and thought to himself that her result was far better than his own had been 10 years ago, and that she must be blessed with both talent and a good environment. Laura came back smiling but clearly nervous. Albert told her it wasn't bad at all. She worried about whether she would get a good evaluation. He told her it was okay and that he thought she'd pass. She immediately lit up and said that if Albert-san praised her, she felt like it would definitely be all right. Albert thought to himself that he wasn't sure why, but she seemed to trust him, and he was glad she looked confident. The next practical exam was announced. Within a time limit, each candidate was to perform magic cancellation using Dispel Magic. Albert's expression changed. He told Laura quietly that this was bad. He couldn't use the cancellation spell. Laura went from cheerful to alarmed in an instant, then immediately brightened up again and offered to teach him right now, since there was still time. Albert said he was counting on her. He thought to himself that struggling all the way to the end wasn't a bad thing. The examinees were called one by one into separate rooms in order of their numbers. Albert found himself alone at a table. On the desk was a meter given by the examiner, and in front of him sat a clay pot with a magic spell cast onto it. The task was to dispel that magic within 10 minutes. Albert picked up the pot and thought he should try. He called out, "Dispel magic." Nothing happened. The pot sat in his hands exactly as before. He tried again and again. Still nothing. He set the pot down and muttered to himself. He thought that miracles didn't happen easily, but he had no choice but to make one happen. There was no way through this other than dispel magic. He tried again and again. Each time the spell failed. He sat back in chair and gripped his head, frustrated. He thought it was just like a replay of 10 years ago. He stared at the pot and the quietly ticking meter beside it. He wondered if it was no good after all. He kept thinking, no matter how much he wished, no magic other than Magic Arrow had ever responded to him. Of the 999 spells that had abandoned him, Magic Arrow was the only one that hadn't. He stared at the pot. A thought formed. Magic Arrow was originally a spell of physical destruction. It shouldn't have any effect on something formless like magic power. But what if he shot the Magic Arrow through the magic cast on the pot, targeting only the magic power itself, not the physical object? If he could do such a thing. From outside the door came the examiner's voice calling his number, 389, saying the meter was ringing and time was up, and ordering him to give up and come out. Albert cast Magic Arrow at the pot one more time, aiming not at the clay, but at the magic infused inside it. The arrow went in and was absorbed into the magic on the pot, passing through it. At that moment, the magic on the pot dispersed. The examiner opened the door, holding the pot with a skeptical look. Albert said he was coming out now. The examiner stared at the pot and asked if the dispel was complete. Albert said it looked like he had made it just in time. The hostile examiner muttered that the meter had been ringing, but conceded grudgingly that he would count it as a pass. Albert thought it didn't matter. He had studied intensively for the written exam in the past, so getting a passing score, there would be no problem. He reflected on what had just happened. He had shot through only the magic power inside the pot, aiming through it precisely. He had never imagined new possibilities for Magic Arrow until now. He thought, wasn't pursuing this exactly what he should be doing? He said quietly to himself that right now, from the bottom of his heart, he wanted to enter the Magic Academy. The written exam followed. When time was called, everyone set down their writing utensils. The examiner announced that results would be posted near the main gate in 3 days. Albert and Laura emerged from the hall together. Laura hurried over and asked if the practical had gone okay. Albert said miracles did happen. Laura clapped and said Albert-san's efforts had borne fruit. She asked if it went well for her too. He asked directly, "Did it go well, Laura?" She answered with a bright yes. He thought to himself that if this was the fruit of the 10 years he had dedicated to Magic Arrow, nothing could make him happier. Laura said she felt confident, but only anxiety crossed her mind. She mentioned she was actually better at cancellation spells than Magic Arrow. Albert said he understood that feeling. The desire to pass was welling up stronger in him now than it ever had in his active days. He told her he was going to stay at an inn in the capital until the results came out. Laura thanked him warmly for helping her with everything, then asked a little shyly if he would like to go see the results together. Albert said he didn't mind. Laura lit up and said, "Great, let's pass together." They decided on a meeting place and time, then parted ways. Albert thought to himself that he hadn't wanted to run into anyone who knew the Oldham, so going their separate ways for now was the right call. He also thought the current him was not Albert Luminous, just Albert. If this step was the beginning of a new path, he couldn't help but hope. Meanwhile, inside the academy, the staff had gathered to go over the results before the announcement. An official stated that tomorrow's announcement would be judged by the criteria decided earlier. Carlisle spoke up and asked them to wait. He wanted an explanation for why a particular examinee had been failed. The staff member he addressed asked what it was Carlisle-sama needed. Carlisle laid it out. Albert, age 26, first practical exam, power, range, and precision all rated special A, though the concern was that his power was so abnormal that it destroyed protected targets, leaving room to suspect cheating. Second practical exam, dispel successful, 0 seconds remaining. Written exam, 68 points. He had crossed the passing line. However, the lead examiner pushed back, saying that given his age, a full 10 years older than the typical examinee, he had an unfair advantage and needed to demonstrate overwhelmingly better results to justify admission. Carlisle smiled and said he saw his point. Then he put her hand on the desk and told them simply, please pass him. The examiner shot back that with all due respect, he was going beyond his authority as an auditor. A staff member added that the second practical was barely within the time limit. The written exam was mediocre, and there were doubts about the first practical. It was hopeless. Another said his grades were simply lackluster. Carlisle said no, it wasn't age discrimination. He cited the kingdom's declaration that everyone has the right to learn and called age-based discrimination inadmirable. He told them again, no reason was needed, please pass him. The examiner raised his voice and said he was ignoring the academy's independence and acting beyond his authority. Carlisle looked at him calmly. Then he straightened and stated that she was not speaking as an auditor, as a court mage with higher authority. She was ordering them to admit him. He said there was plenty of room to squeeze in one student, and it wasn't a big deal. He added that if anyone opposed him, they should be prepared for a corresponding amount of pain. The room went quiet. The staff gave in and said, please admit him. Carlisle thanked them and left. Shortly after, Carlisle was approached by a man he knew, Philbus. He greeted him casually, and he recognized him. He said she was merciless, as always, and that the teaching staff had been furious. Carlisle said he didn't intend to waste time on pointless arguments and would use any means necessary to get people to follow his decisions. Philbus said there was no one left who could oppose him. He agreed pleasantly and said he was counting on him. Carlisle explained to Philbus what he had actually observed. Albert's magic arrow had been abnormal from the start. Originally, another person was scheduled to perform the audit that day, but star reading had shown signs that a great possibility would appear at the exam site, so he had arranged to go himself. When Albert fired at him, even his protective magic couldn't kill the momentum. He had been forced to deflect the trajectory and slam it into the ground, and his right hand had gone numb for some time afterward. He said it had been tough and that he couldn't believe there was power she couldn't handle. She also mentioned there was more to it. He told Philbus that when the examiner raised the suspicion of cheating after the first practical, he had secretly cast an analysis spell on Albert to examine exactly what magic he used. In the second practical, he used only magic arrow, nothing else at all. Philbus was stunned and asked if that meant the man had performed the dispel using magic arrow. Carlisle confirmed it. Philbus caught himself. The examiner had said the magic cancellation was successful. So did that mean he actually dispelled with magic arrow? Carlisle said yes, and that was precisely why he wanted to keep Albert under his supervision. He assigned Philbus to investigate and report on this mysterious student. He grumbled that she was pushing her work onto him. He told him that if Albert entered the academy, observation would be easy enough. Philbus said that hearing all of this, it piqued his interest too. Carlisle smiled. Then her expression turned more serious. He looked out toward the night sky and said quietly that peaceful times didn't last very long. Dark hands were reaching all over the kingdom. He looked in the direction Albert had gone and thought to herself that he hoped Albert was the star of hope that could save it. The final scene shifted to the crowd gathered outside the main gate of the academy. Everyone packed together, anxious for the results to be posted. Among the noise, a familiar voice rang out. It was Laura, who had spotted someone and called out with a bright eye. 3 days after the exam, the results were announced at the main gate. Both numbers, 389 and 390, were on the board. Laura threw her arms in the air, shouting that she passed over and over. Albert stood next to her, staring at the list, and thought to himself that it seemed he had managed to slip in. Laura spun around with tears in her eyes and shouted to the village chief, her grandpa, grandma, her dad, mom's siblings, and everyone back home. Then she poked Albert in the side and said thank you so much. She told him the whole village had pitched in money to send her off and that she had wanted to live up to their expectations. She said this passing was entirely thanks to him. If he hadn't nursed her, if he hadn't brought her to the capital, she would have been disqualified before she even took the exam. Albert said no. She kept insisting it was really true and thanked him over and over. He told her it made him embarrassed when she said that. Then he added quietly that he was grateful to her too. He told her that if he hadn't found her then, he would have still been living quietly in that house, and that because of running into her, he had decided to try his best one more time. She lit up and said that was wonderful, that she was happy if their meeting had meaning. Laura extended her hand toward him and said she looked forward to working with him. She said she was going to challenge the limits of magic arrow there at the academy. He thought to himself that the pain in his heart was still there, but that he had decided to challenge it again and would prove what happened wasn't just a miracle. He took her hand and said likewise. The day after the results announcement, Albert and Laura flew to Laura's village. using magic arrow flight. Laura marveled that they arrived in no time. Albert asked if she had fun, and she said the wind felt good. He asked if the village was close. She pointed and said it was right there, then cast a small light spell to guide the way. She told him that even if the night road was dark, he didn't need to worry. If she was with him, he could get home even with his eyes closed. Right then, a loud voice from the trees demanded to know if anyone was there and ordered them to answer. Laura recognized the voice immediately and called out, asking if it was Uncle Mark. A sturdy man emerged with several others behind him, clearly relieved. He said her name, and that was fast. Laura asked what was wrong and why everyone was gathered together. Mark's expression changed, and he told her something had happened after she left the village. The scene shifted back in time. The very day after Laura had set off for the capital, goblins had attacked the village. Fortunately, there were no casualties, and they had succeeded in driving them off. But the villagers were now guarding the perimeter, wary of a second attack. They understood that if the goblins came at them in earnest, they would have no chance of surviving. So the villagers had sent a request to the local lord asking for troops, and a goblin subjugation was being planned. That evening, a banquet was being held in the village to welcome the soldiers before the subjugation. But the soldiers who arrived were something else entirely. A massive, bald man with a broad grin stood up and loudly declared that they should leave mere goblins to him, Garcia, who would cut them down one after another. He told the villagers to be grateful for the Lord's kindness in sending elites like them to such a cursed village. Albert went quiet at the word cursed village. Meanwhile, at the banquet table, some of the soldiers noticed Laura and called out to her, telling her to come over and keep them company. She ignored the noise and told Albert she'd be right back. Garcia sidled up to her, grabbed her by the shoulder, and said young women were the best. He stared at her white hair and asked if she had witch's blood. She replied that she probably did. Garcia grinned and told her she was coming along on the goblin extermination. He asked if she could use an attack spell or two, and told her it was for the village, and she was coming. Her expression went flat. She said, of course. The next day, the subjugation force moved out into the forest and located the goblin cave. Albert watched the chaotic group advancing and thought Garcia's attitude was unpleasant, but the whole village was united behind it. Laura asked if he was sure he should be helping. He was a guest. He said Albert told Laura to shoot magic arrow, while Garcia shouted at his soldiers to prepare the bows and ordered them to fire the moment the girl used her magic. Laura said she understood. Albert thought to himself that he understood too. Laura called out magic arrow. A burst of white bolts scattered across the goblin force. The soldiers fired their arrows in the same moment, and goblins fell across the field. Garcia immediately screamed that her timing was off and called her a clumsy fool. He ordered everyone to keep shooting. The battle dissolved into confusion, with soldiers yelling at each other and the villagers struggling to hold the line. Albert watched from the side and thought he hadn't expected much to begin with, but this was a terrible mess. He told himself he couldn't watch any longer. He raised his hand and cast magic arrow quietly. A massive force tore through the cave entrance. The sound shook everything. Garcia and the soldiers stumbled back, stunned. Albert turned and asked if that was the end. Laura looked at him and said his name quietly. Albert said no, there were still around 50 inside the cave, and the Goblin Lord would be in the back. A Goblin Lord was a threat on an entirely different level from ordinary goblins. He said the safest and most efficient way to wipe them out was to fire magic arrow and bounce the shots off the cave walls repeatedly, letting the reflections fill the interior. Laura stared at him and asked if it was really over with this. Albert fired again. Garcia immediately rallied his men and ordered everyone to follow him in to check on the goblins. Showed the cave floor wet and still. Garcia raised a blade inside and laughed, calling it nothing but corpses and declaring it his achievement. Laura turned to Albert and quietly told him he was amazing. He said it wasn't that big of a deal. Garcia pressed deeper and asked if this was the deepest part, calling it nothing but small fry. Albert told him it was not over yet. Laura said his name. Garcia laughed and asked if they were all dead already. Something stirred in the rubble at the back of the cave. Eyes opened in the dark. The Goblin Lord burst upright, wounded and enraged. Garcia laughed again and said this was great. A wounded Goblin Lord was his to hunt down personally. Albert looked at the creature. He noticed it had used one of its own kind as a shield against the earlier blast. Garcia charged forward, shouting that it was his victory. His soldiers engaged from the sides. The Goblin Lord retaliated savagely, and Garcia roared at it to just die, asking what it was. The Goblin Lord slammed Garcia hard enough to send him crashing into the cave wall. His soldiers screamed his name and told everyone to run. Albert cast magic arrow. The bolt punched through the Goblin Lord in a single shot, and it dropped. The soldiers stared in silence. One of them said, "Impossible." Laura turned and told Albert he was amazing. Back at the village that evening, Laura's uncle sat across from Albert and said he had heard the story, taking down that Goblin Lord in one hit was something else. Albert said he was nothing and that Laura was better than him. The uncle laughed and said he liked Albert's humility. He told Albert that Laura had talent too, though not as much as him, and asked him to get along with her at the academy. Then someone interrupted. Laura's father walked in and took a seat. He said it seemed his daughter had been in Albert's care. He had heard the story and told Albert that seemed like he had played a big role. Albert said he was just lucky. Her father studied him and said it was their first meeting, but he thought Albert was a trustworthy person. He poured himself a drink and said he was going to entrust his daughter to Albert. Albert confirmed they were talking about supporting each other as fellow students. Her father's eyes lit up and he started saying what he really wanted was for Albert to take Laura as his bride. Laura immediately lost her composure and shouted at her father to wait, demanding to know what he was saying. Her father leaned back and said there was an order to things, but if Albert followed the steps, there was no problem. He told him to think about it during his time at the academy. Then he added that staying in Laura's room tonight would be the next step. Albert stood in the doorway, completely thrown, asking if this step was a bit different, while Laura called it far too awkward. That night, lying in the dark, Laura apologized for her father. Albert told her it was fine and not to worry. She looked out at the night sky and said she probably wouldn't be able to make friends at the academy, so if it wasn't a bother, she would like to continue being good friends with Albert. Then she asked if he knew the Witch of Calamity. The scene shifted to an explanation. The Witch of Calamity was a skilled mage with white hair and red eyes who had mastered 500 attack spells. One day, she had challenged the entire kingdom with her overwhelming power. The result was her defeat. She caused great damage to the kingdom in the process and had been loathed ever since. Laura explained that her village was created by blood relatives of that witch. It was why they were called a cursed village. Laura told Albert that her white hair was also inherited from the witch's blood and magic power, and that as long as she lived as a mage, she could not escape this curse. The village wasn't treated well by country because of it. Albert asked why she aimed to become a mage even with all that hardship. She said it was because she wanted to be useful to everyone, and that maybe if she contributed enough as a mage, things might change. Then she asked quietly whether he would still be her friend, even knowing all that. Albert said of course. He told her he would be her friend forever, and he swore it. She said she was really glad she had met him. They wished each other good night. The next morning, her father was still at it. He appeared in the doorway, asking whether there really had been no mistake the night before. Laura shouted that nothing happened. Her father told Albert to come back anytime and that he was always welcome. Albert told Laura's father that he and Laura were friends and there was nothing like that. Laura lit up and confirmed they were friends. Albert told her father he would see her at the academy and cast magic arrow to fly off. He thought to himself that his second life at the Magic Academy was beginning. The scene jumped ahead to the opening ceremony of the Royal Academy of Magic. Albert and Laura stood together in uniform as the principal welcomed the new students, wished them to leave a great mark on the kingdom, and told them to give it their all. 1 month later, Albert and Laura sat together at a desk surrounded by books. Laura sighed that making friends was difficult. Albert agreed. For him it was his age, and for Laura it was her lineage. He said he didn't care about himself, but he hoped Laura could enjoy her student life. Laura immediately told him that wasn't true. She was genuinely happy to be in the same class as him and told him to work hard together toward getting their school badges. The school crest was a badge awarded only to students who achieved specific grades. They were ranked in 5 stages: stone, iron, silver, gold, and mithril, failing to obtain one by the end of each school year meant expulsion. Laura said their homeroom teacher Philbus had told them they could graduate once they reached silver. Albert said that hadn't changed since his first time. He noted that first years were stone, second years iron, and third year silver. Anyone could achieve it just by living a normal student life. Albert thought back to the first time he had been at the academy. He had failed to earn the school emblem, the final chance being the grade exam, and had fled the academy as if running away. Back in the present, Laura slapped a book shut and said it was quite a surprise, wasn't it? Albert sat quietly and wondered to himself whether he would be able to get his hands on the emblem this time. Laura marveled aloud that she couldn't believe Professor Philbus and Lord Carlisle of the Court Mages had been classmates. She looked over at Albert with excitement and asked what kind of friends he had had during his student days. He thought back. He recalled that many people had approached him at first, but only because of his title as a son of a marquis. As soon as they realized he had no talent, they all cut ties with him. But there had been one friend who never gave up on him until the end. Albert stood quietly in the memory of the academy grounds. He said only that he was fine. That memory showed a younger Albert with 2 people beside him, Lugard and Feline. Feline told him to have confidence, that he could do it this time. Lugard said it with certainty too, that it would definitely be okay. They had believed in him. Albert snapped back to the present. He thought of how he had thrown away their trust and run away. Laura immediately apologized and asked if she hadn't been supposed to ask. He told her no. Then quietly he said he had had 2 friends, though he wondered to himself whether he even had the right to call them that. Albert's thoughts were interrupted when someone bumped into Laura from from behind. A woman's voice asked if she was Laura. It was Fuline holding a clipboard, telling her she wanted her to come along for the water quality survey starting tomorrow. She explained that pollution had been spreading rapidly in a lake in the kingdom, that the academy was launching an investigation and selecting top students to take along, and that there had been a last-minute mistake on the participant list. Was a short notice okay? Then she called him Albert Cohen, and he looked up, startled. She said his name again as a question. Albert Cohen, really? He said him. She asked if he knew each other, then quickly confirmed it herself. Yes, they had been in school together. Her name was Feline. She asked if he knew each other. Laura, standing nearby, asked the same question. Albert asked Feline to give them a moment, and Laura understood and stepped away. Albert said it had been a long time. Feline said she never expected to see him again at the academy. He said she had come back here too, and she explained it was common for graduates to get jobs at the academy. She smiled and said fate had brought her here. Albert said he was sorry he couldn't live up to her expectations from 10 years ago, and that it was a fact he had run away. He told Laura about the past yet, and said she would keep quiet about it. She said the past wasn't something to be ashamed of, and that they had all known he was working hard. Albert pressed his hands together and apologized for 10 years ago. Feline shook her head. She said she was just happy that Albert Cohen hadn't thrown away magic. She moved on quickly, remembering she had something to tell him. He was coming along for the water quality survey too. Albert looked at the documents she shoved at him and asked if he had caused some trouble. She told him it wasn't a joke, it was mandatory participation, and that he had been decided suddenly by instructions from above, meaning it was an order from a country. Albert said he had no idea what that was about. Feline said it was suspicious, but that it was just like him, and told him to make the most of it since it was a rare chance. Albert, he also asked, by the way, was Lugard doing well? Paused and said that name. Albert asked where he was now, told her that Lugard had talent and left achievements behind. He had become a magic knight, but he participated in a certain mission and never came back. He died 5 years ago. Feline went still, and that you really never knew what would happen in life. She told Albert to be careful too, and that she was a little curious about his story. The next day, Albert and Laura arrived together at a large lake. Laura exclaimed at how big it was. Albert noted the other side was far away. Their teacher, Feline, greeted everyone brightly and announced it was Lake Vichern. Originally, it had been very beautiful, but it had gotten dirty in the last 6 months or so. Laura asked why it had gotten dirty. Feline said good question, and then admitted they came to investigate because they didn't know. She outlined the plan. The official survey team would conduct the investigation itself, while the students would practice water purification magic, and certain students would be asked to help with the actual survey. Feline told everyone they could purify dirty water all they wanted and to practice hard. Albert stared at the dark, murky surface of the lake and said nothing. Laura cast purification, and a small section of the water cleared. Albert thought to himself as expected, then added that there was always someone better. A much larger stretch of the lake surface cleared in an instant. Someone in the background said that was amazing. Another voice identified the speaker. He was the freshman representative, Lord Blaine Milch. Blaine turned to Laura and said he thought she had already mastered 80 spells, with a condescending sort of praise. She flushed and said she was still just a trainee. Albert thought to himself that he only had one spell, but there was no point in rushing, and that he had decided to walk his own path. He also wondered inwardly whether magic arrow could purify water, and if it was possible, how he would do it. Nearby, a girl with long white blonde hair and ribbon decorations was telling her companion that they should ask the water spirits living in the lake instead. She said she could perform as many spirit summons as she wanted. Her name was Ms. Nia, and she was from the prestigious Fadhel family. She complained loudly that they wouldn't let her join the investigation team. Laura suggested she stop, and Ms. Nia whipped around on her. She said to think of someone born in a cursed village talking to her, and called it disgusting. Laura told her it was dangerous to summon a spirit while the mana in the lake was unstable. Ms. Nia ignored her and shouted that keeping a spirit under control was exactly how a mage showed their skill, then called out the spirit of water. A great water spirit rose from the lake, the upper half of a woman on the back of a massive horse, both darkened and corrupted. Ms. Nia demanded the spirit tell her why the lake was being polluted. The spirit turned its eyes to her and said something dark and unpleasant had been defiling them, and that it was the people on land who kept throwing things away. Ms. Nia pressed harder, demanding to know what dark and unpleasant meant. The spirit began to speak further, but something was wrong. The mana around the lake surged violently. The spirit convulsed, screaming in distorted sounds, its form twisting and collapsing into darkness. The surface of the lake churned and spilled outward. Ms. Nia stumbled back and said no, demanding to know what that was. The spirit's voice came from within the darkness. It said it had to go, and then it was gone. Beneath the surface, a dark figure moved through the murk. Another voice spoke, something ancient, something that answered to a master. It said it was coming, and that next it would take its master to the magnificent lake bed. Night had fallen. The students camped by the lake. Laura and her companion sat by the fire talking quietly. The dark something in the lake moved closer to the surface. Feline noticed a disturbance on the water and cast lighting, illuminating the edge of the lake. A student called out to the teacher, pointing. Something was rising from the lake. Two figures, black-skinned and centaur-shaped, climbing onto the shore and moving toward the camp. The frenzied water spirit. Feline pointed her wand and demanded the students separate. Team A was to contact the main water survey unit about the emergency, while teams B and C were to wake the sleeping students. The corrupted spirit looked at Feline with cold amusement and remarked it was strange, as the humans had been the ones who summoned her. Feline confronted a student and asked if that was the water spirit summoned during the day. The student confirmed it. While Feline had been away, Lady Manhwa had summoned a water spirit, though the attempt had ended in failure. Feline pressed her glasses and thought to herself that she should have been more careful. She couldn't believe there had been a first year capable of spirit summoning. Feline raised her wand and commanded the spirit of water to return to where it belonged, casting Release Spirit. The corrupted figure snarled back that it was no use and demanded to know if she dared stand in its way. Before it could act, a magic arrow shot from the shoreline. Feline noted that the spirit was regenerating, but that the mud doll's subordinates at least did not recover from the arrows. She shouted for everyone to retreat while firing magic arrows and ordered them to target the mud dolls. The spirit turned its gaze on Feline and warned that if she interfered, she would die. Blaine stepped forward and told the professor he would back her up, that it was too dangerous for her alone. Feline warned him sharply. He was the son of a marquis and a rising star, and if she let him get hurt, she would lose her job. Blaine grinned and said it was okay, that he refused to be the kind of man who died in a place like this. A voice called out urgently for Albert to wake up. Albert was shaken awake inside a tent. Laura told him frantically that the water spirits from earlier had attacked them, along with their mud golem subordinates, and that everyone was evacuating while fighting, but that Professor Feline had stayed behind alone in enemy territory. She grabbed his arm and urged him to go help right now. Albert stared ahead and thought to himself that if he joined the fight, he would only be more work for Feline to look after. Laura called him amazing and looked at him with wide eyes. Albert's inner voice corrected her. She had the wrong idea. He thought to himself that he had given up 10 years ago, and that magic arrow was the only spell he could use. He could not keep hiding it anymore. He stood with his back to her and said he would go. He turned and told her plainly that he could only use a single spell, that he was a mage worth only 1,000th of a mage who controlled 1,000. That was what he was. Laura looked at him quietly. She said she'd had a feeling he could only use a few spells. Laura looked up at him and said, but wasn't that enough? She pointed out all the times his magic arrow had saved her when they were attacked by the Goblin Lord, when they were about to be late for the entrance exam. She said that kindness and strength were exactly what made him who he was, and that she believed he was a hero more than anyone else. She grabbed his sleeve and told him please not to say he was worthless. Albert said her name. He asked her quietly, did she think he could save Furin? Laura answered without hesitation, of course, if it was him. She was sure he could. Albert had no confidence. He thought to himself that he was worthless and could not believe in himself. But the girl in front of him believed in him regardless, and that was reason enough. He told her to let's go save her. For the sake of Laura, who believed he was a hero, he would become one. Albert and Laura arrived at the lakeshore. He took in the scale of it. There were a great many of them. He raised his hand and fired magic arrow in a wide, sweeping barrage across the enemy. Laura watched beside him, stunned. The mud dolls were struck and fell. Laura stared at what remained and let out a breathless wow. Then from somewhere in the chaos came a screaming voice, someone calling for help. Albert fired magic arrow to intercept an attack heading toward Manhwa, who had been knocked to the ground. He asked if she was okay. Manhwa looked up with her characteristic pride still intact and said she supposed she should thank him, though she told Laura not to come any closer when Laura tried to help her up. Manhwa bristled that a descendant of the cursed village had dared touch her, but then caught herself and said she would put up with Albert since he was at least a commoner man. She demanded he take her somewhere safe. Albert said nothing, and she shouted at Laura whether she thought she could get away with this. Albert cast magic arrow to shield him and began moving her. Laura protested that he couldn't do that. Albert told her he had to. It was the only way to get through to her. He looked at Manhwa directly and told her that Laura had been trying to help her, that it didn't matter if she was a commoner or a noble. She was wrong as a human being and to apologize. He said if she wanted to be saved, she should show at least some basic decency. Manhwa went quiet and said she was sorry, her voice small. Laura told her it was all right, that she didn't mind at all. Albert turned toward the chaos of battle and told Laura he would leave the mud dolls, then charged forward toward Furin. He called out to Furin that he had come to help. Furin shouted back that it was dangerous and told Albert to run away. She explained that the creature was no ordinary spirit. They couldn't defeat it unless they destroyed the core in its chest, but the chest defense was particularly thick. The spirit sneered that he had seen through it well, but that even that was futile. What could he do with his puny strength? Albert thought, no matter how hard a surface was, there had to be a weak point somewhere. He declared magic arrow and fired at full power at the core. The spirit took the shot and collapsed. The darkness dissipated. Albert stood and told Furin it was over. Both Furin and Blaine stood in stunned silence. Blaine murmured that Magic Arrow had done that it was impossible. The next morning, Albert stood alone at the edge of the lake. There had been no deaths from the night's commotion, only injuries. He reflected on the moment he had pierced the spirit's core, that sensation of repelling filth from the water, the same feeling as when his magic arrow had replicated the cancellation magic. He wondered quietly whether that sensation could also trigger an evolution in his magic. He raised his hand and fired magic arrow at the murky water. Something happened. A different feeling passed through him. He cast it again, wider this time, and watched the surface of a lake clear before him. He stared at it and said quietly he had done it. It was purified. He saw the path forward now. He understood that he still had potential. He threw his arms wide toward the morning sky and let out a shout of release. 1 week later, he stood before the principal of the academy in a full assembly. The principal announced that in a moment of critical danger, Albert had demonstrated extraordinary ability and saved the students from a dire ordeal. In recognition of these achievements, he was awarded the Iron School Badge. After the ceremony, Furin found him and said, "Congratulations, truly." She said the past 10 years and the 10 years before that had not been in vain, and that his hard work had finally paid off. She told him, "Welcome back, Albert." Nearby, Philbus spoke quietly with Carlyle. He asked whether his hunch had been right. He said he had only taken Albert along for the water quality survey. Philbus said he had finished off the spirit with a single blow, and that according to the Academy's report, what Albert had defeated was a frenzied water spirit. The most crucial part, what magic he had actually used to kill it, was missing from the report. Carlyle said, as one might expect, it was a magic arrow. Philbus raised an eyebrow. The scene shifted to Carlyle, and Philbus noted that the Academy remained skeptical about the whole incident. The more serious a person was, the harder it must be to accept what had happened. She held a vial of dark liquid before him and said it was the sewage the investigation team had brought back, heavily saturated with darkness. She said that to think a mere magic arrow had defeated a spirit body enhanced with the power of darkness was remarkable. She wondered what dark force types had been doing in that massive lake. Philbus said he had no idea. Carlyle said it would not be surprising if something legendary was involved, given the sheer scale of the contamination. She glanced toward the window where Albert and Laura stood together in the distance. He said that they might truly need him to become this country's hero. After all, young Albert. That is, the scene cut away to a dark corridor. A masked figure arrived and said so this was where the other person had been. A second figure, old and hunched, asked whether the first had steeled himself to shroud the kingdom in darkness. The masked figure said he had been prepared for that for 5 years now. The old one laughed softly and said how rude of him to test the strength of their heart like that. He asked if they needed something. The old figure handed over a dark, jagged sword and said to use it. The magic sword, Dainsleaf. He explained that the ritual to revive a decayed magic sword required a vast amount of water and a space to process miasma. He noted that the 6 months of training at the lake had paid off and that they had managed to trick Carlyle at first, though it was becoming difficult to keep deceiving him. The old one said that they had been one step ahead of them and that he had been nervous when the investigation team from the Royal Academy of Magic arrived. The masked figure held the sword and said it was a fine sword and gave his thanks. The old one said there was no need. He would spare no effort for the sake of their long-held ambition. The masked figure stood in candlelight and spoke of hardships being rewarded when their wishes were fulfilled. The old one bowed and addressed him as the Prince of Darkness, telling him to bring about the Age of Darkness once more. Back at the Academy, Philbus dismissed the class and told Albert and Laura to follow him. Laura looked curious and asked what it would be about. They followed him through the halls. Philbus led them to a room where Carlyle was already waiting. He greeted Albert warmly and said, "Long time no see." He turned to Laura and said he believed this was their first meeting. Laura lit up at the sight of him. Carlyle told Albert he wanted him to join the army. He explained that the kingdom was planning a military deployment and wanted to add a skilled mage to the ranks. Albert said he was not keen on facing other humans. Carlyle said the enemy was not human. She explained the enemy, a lizardman village, and a fairly large one. Lizardmen were bipedal lizards standing over 2 meters tall, strong but unintelligent, with primitive equipment, yet extremely powerful in individual combat and a pain to face head-on. Up until now, the kingdom had lived apart from them under a policy of non-interference. Carlyle continued. Lately, those from the other side had begun breaking through the boundary. He said he had already dispatched knights to handle it. Albert's expression shifted. Carlyle delivered the grim follow-up. The knights had been wiped out. A well-trained order should have been able to defeat them easily, Laura said, her voice uncertain. The reason, Carlyle explained, was that someone called a crestmaster had settled in the Lizardman village some time ago. Individuals engraved with a crest were enhanced, and half-hearted forces were no match for them. As a result, the strength of the marshland lizardmen had become a force that could not be ignored. Carlyle told Albert he expected him to demonstrate his power to the fullest. This was a battle to protect humanity. Albert said he understood. He then added that he wanted Laura to accompany him as well. Albert immediately objected and said Laura was still just a child. Carlyle said he wanted to respect individual opinions, but then turned to Laura and asked if she knew about her own village, noting that if Laura performed well, she would surely gain the favor of nobles and royalty. Didn't that align with Laura's own wishes? Laura answered yes. She wished to be of use to her country. Albert looked at her, then back at Carlyle, and reminded him he had said Laura would be accompanying him. Carlyle smiled and said he had said it himself. Albert said plainly, then he would protect Laura. Albert thought to himself that he still could not think of himself as talented, but that if the royal mage acknowledged it, and if Laura believed in him, then he must have something in him. He resolved to use this power to protect Laura. He said quietly, let's give it our all. Laura answered yes. In the hallway afterward, Philbus confronted Carlyle and asked irritably why he was sending a student to the battlefield if she hated it that much. Carlyle said that Albert was like a kite with its string cut, too detached from the world, and that Laura was necessary to guide him. He added that Laura had talent. Combat experience would be an asset to her, and that the kingdom placed great importance on white-hair talent, with Laura's village having records dating back to ancient times. Carlyle mused that Laura's purity was overwhelming even compared to past generations, almost like the second coming of the Calamity Witch. Philbus said Carlyle was overthinking it, that Laura had a great personality and excellent academic attitude, and that there was no way she would become like the Calamity Witch. Carlyle's expression did not change. He said he was looking forward to that future himself, though. Albert and Laura set out. Laura noted that the war had already begun. Philbus arrived behind them with a relaxed stride and said that Carlyle's orders had been late, so they were going to be tardy for the first battle. They reached the edge of a forest where soldiers were in retreat. One of them shouted at the group to watch out and to run. A crest-bearing lizard man crashed through the trees, enormous, with swirling tribal markings across its body. Philbus stepped forward and said calmly that he would end this in one shot. Philbus cast Fireball. A massive rolling sphere of flame erupted from his hand and tore through the air. The blast hit the crest-bearing lizard man and a cluster of others behind it. When the smoke cleared, the lizard man still stood, scorched but unbroken. Laura stared in disbelief and said, as expected of Professor Philbus, that he could cast attack-specialized magic so effortlessly. Albert's expression was grim. Philbus stared at the lizard man and said flatly, "You've got to be kidding me. A lizard man that could take his fireball and walk away unscathed? No way." Albert raised his hand and cast magic arrow. A broad wave of arrows erupted outward in a sweeping arc, striking the cluster of lizard men one after another, cutting them down in rapid succession. The lizard men fell and went still. Philbus turned to Albert and said incredulously that he had taken those things down with magic arrow. Albert said it was only because Philbus's fireball had weakened them first. Behind them, a voice spoke, a soldier asking if they were with the Magic Academy. The soldier introduced himself as Richard Strom, captain of the 4th Detached Unit, and thanked them for saving his men. He explained that they had been ordered to charge ahead of the main force as a diversion, but the enemy had been unexpectedly strong, and they had been forced to retreat, and then pursued relentlessly. Philbus said plainly that there was no point in heading to the main battlefield now, and that he had business to attend to and needed to return. Philbus observed that the captain's subordinates had already reached their limit and told him to look closely. His men were exhausted. He noted they had already achieved the initial diversion and invited them to come with the group to the main camp as guards. The battered soldiers looked at each other and agreed. They reached the main camp. Philbus told Albert and Laura to go back to the dormitories and rest, as he had business to attend to. The soldier, Lichard, spoke up and said there was something he wanted to discuss with the two of them. Albert addressed him as Lord Lichard. Lichard laughed and said Albert was older than him anyway, and not to be so formal. Lichard said he was heading back to report and invited Albert and Laura to come with him to see the commander-in-chief. Albert asked what kind of talk it was. Since they had saved his life, he would love to introduce them. Albert moment he agreed and asked about Laura. Lichard said he was sure she was welcome to. On the way, Lichard told them bluntly that the general of this army was one heartless bastard. He explained that the main force was full of noble sons and people favored by the kingdom, so the dirty work was pushed onto the nobodies. Detached units like his were sent into enemy lines before the main force charged, a cold-blooded tactic built on sacrifices. Laura looked shaken. Lichard addressed Philbus and said that he had a family name and was a noble himself. He should already know how it worked. The conversation outside the commander's tent continued without Albert and Laura. Two soldiers standing nearby remarked that Lichard was likely just a poor baron, a noble in name only, and that such types were even easier to exploit than commoners, since their loyalty to the crown made them work like cart horses to support their destitute families. Laura's expression fell quiet. Albert said he would pass on that, excused himself, and stepped away. Lichard's voice followed behind. "Shall we get going, Albert?" Walking through the camp together, Lichard mentioned that the 1st Detached Force had been completely wiped out, and that people were talking about Ryhilt and the others in the detachment. He said it was a dangerous role, but that they knew they were just pawns with no choice. They had to give it their all. He told Albert to just watch. He would be a duke in the end, because there were people who had risen to the top that way. Albert told him flatly not to die. Richard looked at him, surprised, then smiled and said it was fine. He had strong devil's luck, despite how he looked. Leave it to him. He straightened up and announced himself to the guard at the tent entrance. Richter Sturm of the 4th Independent Squad, reporting for duty. A voice inside said simply, "Get in." Inside the tent, a figure stood over a map, tall, dark-haired, with a composed and faintly amused expression. A soldier near the entrance announced, "Alenzia Luminous." Albert went still. The figure at the map looked up. Albert said quietly, "Alenzia?"